When you go into business with someone, you expect trust, that silent agreement that you'll both work hard, win together, and share the rewards. That's what I thought when I partnered with Ryan 3 years ago. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who could convince anyone to invest. I was the quiet one, the brains behind the numbers, the person who made things actually work. Together, we built something real. Or at least, I thought we did. It started small, late payments from clients, deals being signed without my knowledge, invoices missing from our shared drive. Ryan brushed it off, saying, "It's all under control, buddy. Focus on the projects." I trusted him, until one morning, I got a call from our bank. They said there were irregularities in our company account, suspicious transfers, large amounts moving to unknown vendors. My heart dropped. I rushed to the office, only to find Ryan already there, pacing, pretending to be worried. "Man, this looks bad," he said, shaking his head. "The auditors think someone's been siphoning funds. You handled the transactions, right?" His tone hit me like a blade. My hands went cold. In one sentence, he'd shifted all the suspicion onto me. 4 days, rumors spread. Employees whispered, investors stopped replying, and our accountant avoided eye contact. I couldn't believe it. Ryan was framing me for fraud in my own company. The place I helped build was turning into a courtroom, and I was the one on trial. That night, I sat in the empty office, staring at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. Anger burned through the confusion. I realized then, this wasn't about money anymore. It was about betrayal, pride, and power. And I made myself one promise: if he wanted a war, I'd fight it silently, and I'd win. After Ryan pushed suspicion onto me, every second felt like walking on glass. The office turned cold, people kept their distance, investors called with clipped voices, and I watched as months of my work dissolved into doubt. But panic didn't help. Fear didn't help. Only facts helped. So I did what I knew how to do. I started building the facts, piece by piece. First, I stopped reacting and started documenting. I printed everything I could access legally: the transaction logs I had permission to see, the server timestamps, the version histories of files. I used the company's audit trail, the same tool I had helped implement years ago, to track who touched which invoice and when. The audit trail was a blessing and a trap. It recorded activity, but someone with enough access could try to cover their tracks. That's why I saved multiple copies and emailed dated PDFs to my personal, secure account, so nothing could be quietly altered. Next, I turned to the people who still mattered. I quietly reached out to the head of IT, someone who trusted me and respected the work I'd done. I didn't ask him to hack anything. I asked for logs and for a plain report of user access to the financial systems. He agreed, eyes dark with the same anger I felt. Together we uncovered odd access patterns, logins at odd hours tied to Ryan's badge, file downloads from an external IP address that didn't match any partner's known locations, and a suspicious batch of invoice exports that corresponded with the missing transfers. I also leaned on the accountant who handled our books. He'd been quiet since the bank called, but when I sat down with him over coffee and showed him what I had, his face hardened. He paged through spreadsheets with a stolid calm and found something I hadn't expected: fake vendor IDs and repeated reimbursements that followed a pattern. "These aren't bookkeeping errors," he said. "They're engineered entries." He agreed to pull the original source files and to notarize copies of anything that looked forged. Every piece of evidence had to be preservable, verifiable in court if it came to that. So I logged dates, times, and witness names in a private notebook, knowing that recollections matter as much as data when the first wave of denials comes. I never once told Ryan or anyone on his inner circle what I was doing. I kept my face neutral at work and my phone on silent, because paranoia breeds mistakes, and I had learned that lesson before. There were close calls. One night I nearly got caught copying a folder when the cleaning crew's radio crackled and Ryan's junior associate took an unscheduled walk past my desk. I held my breath, minimized screens, and smiled as if I'd been doing nothing at all. My hands trembled after he left. I knew then that this had to be methodical. One slip would allow him to claim I was the one tampering with records. I also started building an external timeline. Emails, meeting minutes, press releases, anything that showed public-facing claims of who did what, were gathered and time-stamped. I compared those public narratives to internal commits and version control. In several cases, code commits and design documents showed my username long before public announcements credited Ryan. That alone was a thread strong enough to pull. Then came the financial trail. I couldn't access every bank account, nor should I have, but the bank's suspicious activity report that had been sent to us included transaction IDs and beneficiary details. I pulled those into a spreadsheet and traced them back to shell companies. I hired a forensic accountant, discreetly, under a confidentiality agreement, who specialized in tracing beneficial owners of offshore entities. She worked with a network of contacts and dug where I couldn't. In exchange for her fees, she wanted truth as much as I did. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a puzzle. The forensic work revealed a quiet horror, funds routed through layers of shell companies, then into luxury purchases and private investments in jurisdictions designed to hide ownership. The forensic accountant mapped the web and, crucially, found a consistent link, an account that ultimately pointed to a firm associated with Ryan's family name. It wasn't an instant smoking gun, there were legal buffers and nominee boards, but with the patterns we built, the circumstantial case became strong. I also tapped into one of the most effective tools we had: witnesses. The people who'd seen Ryan's behavior up close. A junior project manager told me about a private meeting where Ryan had insisted that a client's check be handled through operations, the exact phrasing that later matched an off-the-books transaction. A former contractor mentioned being offered a consulting fee routed to a different company. Each reluctant story added weight. I promised confidentiality, and in return they provided dates, screenshots, and even WhatsApp conversations. Fear binds people in silence. A promise of protection frees them to speak. While I gathered evidence, I built a legal plan. I consulted a lawyer, one who understood corporate fraud and whistleblower protections. We mapped a way forward that prioritized my safety and legal standing. The lawyer advised me not to confront Ryan publicly, warned against taking any action that could be called tampering, and helped me prepare a sealed packet of evidence for the board and regulators. He also advised contacting the bank and reporting the fraud formally, steps we would take only after we had airtight documentation so the initial report couldn't be dismissed as a spurned partner's grievance. Emotionally, this phase was brutal. I kept my professional mask on, even when it felt like it would crack. I volunteered for extra tasks, attended social events with a smile, and nodded as Ryan gave speeches about teamwork. But at night I felt the weight of the betrayal. I lost sleep. I replayed every kindness he'd used against me. The ache of being used fueled my focus. It wasn't just about money, it was about being erased, about the audacity of someone who could profit off another's labor while smiling in their face. The final piece of my plan involved timing. I knew public exposure would trigger swift defensive moves, lawyers, denials, frantic damage control. If I revealed everything during a meeting where stakeholders could not act, he might still escape long enough to hide assets. So we chose a moment when the board would be present and when regulatory attention could be quickly engaged. I coordinated with the forensic accountant and my lawyer to ensure the evidence would be received by authorities at the same time the board saw it. Simultaneously, I reached out to a journalist I trusted, someone who specialized in corporate investigations but had a reputation for ethical reporting. She agreed to hold the story until we had all channels ready. The pressure was immense. I had to balance stealth with urgency. I rehearsed my presentation, how to speak without rage, how to let documents make the case rather than accusations. The lawyer coached me on phrasing, the accountant prepared visual timelines, the IT head prepared an independent report on access logs. We created a packet so robust that even a seasoned PR machine would struggle to spin it away. There were moments I doubted the path. Could I have taken this to the board sooner and avoided all the collateral damage? Would exposing him ruin the company I'd helped build? These questions lingered like shadows. But when I pictured Ryan sliding payments into an offshore account while our employees' salaries went late, when I thought of the investors deceived, I knew that protecting a lie would be complicity. The night before the confrontation, I sat at my kitchen table, the sealed folder before me, and breathed. Friends checked in, oblivious to the storm. My palms shook. I thought of my family, my reputation, and the career I had poured years into. I thought of the junior staff who trusted me, and I thought of the version of myself that would be content letting this pass. That woman felt small. This version, quiet, meticulous, relentless, was ready. When I walked into the boardroom the next morning, I carried not just paper but a verdict of sorts, evidence assembled carefully, witnesses ready, authorities on standby. I was still the calm employee in the board's eyes, but inside, iron. The plan was set. The trap was laid. The man who had used me to get rich had no idea his system, built of greed and deceit, was about to be pulled apart thread by thread. The morning of the board meeting felt unnaturally calm. Outside, the city moved like it always did. Traffic, delivery trucks, people with coffee, but inside me everything was sharpened to a blade. I walked into the glass-fronted conference room carrying the sealed packet. The notarized copies, printed logs, screenshots, witness statements, and the forensic accountant's report. My lawyer walked in behind me, a quiet presence. The IT head took a seat at the end of the table. He had the independent access logs ready on his laptop. The air smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. It felt like the scene before a verdict. Ryan arrived in his tailored suit, the same man who had sat beside me in celebration and then turned on me in suspicion. He smiled at the board as if everything was business as usual. I kept my face neutral. I had rehearsed my tone 1,000 times. Measured, factual, relentless. Rage would be a liability. Evidence would be my weapon. The chairman called the meeting to order. I was given the floor. I began simply. No accusations, no theatrics. I spoke as if I were reading minutes, dates, transaction IDs, timestamps. I showed the board the timeline where invoices had been exported and payments routed to shell companies. Side by side, the commits and approval chains bore my username long before any official authorization. The IT head displayed independent access logs, badge swipes at odd hours, VPN logins from external IPs that matched transfers, file downloads tied to Ryan's credentials. The forensic report traced beneficiaries back through a chain of nominee companies to an address tied to Ryan's family holdings. Faces changed. Confusion became concern, and concern turned to alarm. Ryan tried to interrupt twice, voice clipped and defensive, but the chairman asked him to wait while the documents were reviewed. The lawyer I'd engaged explained how the evidence had been preserved and notarized, how jump-proof the chain of custody was. The board could not ignore it. When the first wave of questions came, they weren't to me but to Ryan. Why were these payments routed this way? Someone asked. Who authorized these vendor payouts? The color drained from his face. He searched for the practiced calm he wore in investor dinners and press photos, but it frayed under scrutiny. He blamed clerical errors at first, then miscommunications, then stammered that he had been trying to protect company interests. The excuses landed like paper against steel. We had the receipts, the emails, the bank confirmations. Then came the witnesses. One by one, people I had met with in secret, a junior project manager, an ex-contractor, and now former accountant. Each corroborated pieces of the story in quiet, factual tones. They spoke about off-the-books operations, about meetings where Ryan had insisted checks be handled through different channels, and about casual comments that suddenly made sense in the light of the evidence. Their testimony was careful, not vengeful. It was the sound of truth. The board reacted the way institutions do when their spine is finally snapped. Swift, procedural, and cold. An independent audit was authorized on the spot. Ryan was asked to step aside pending investigation. Legal counsel was engaged. A freeze was placed on certain accounts, an initial, protective move to prevent assets from being moved while authorities were notified. Outside that conference room, the first tremors started. A quiet phone call to the bank, the same bank that had originally flagged suspicious activity, resulted in investigators arriving to review transaction histories. Regulatory compliance officers were notified. Within hours, whispers became calls, and calls became a notice. Law enforcement had opened a file. The company's clean public image cracked. The PR team scrambled to draft a neutral statement, but nothing could gloss the first official words: "We are cooperating with investigations." The fallout was not instantaneous total collapse, these things rarely are, but it was decisive. Investors demanded emergency briefings. Some pulled funding calls, others froze further investments pending full clarity. Media, scenting a story, contacted the company and soon drafted queries that would eventually become headlines. Ryan's professional reputation, the glossy veneer he had polished for years, split along the seams. Colleagues who had been his allies drifted away. The man who had once commanded the room found himself sidelined, eyes avoiding the people he had tried to manipulate. For me, the days that followed were surreal. There was a strange moral dissonance in watching a man who tried to ruin me for money now reduced to a hollow figure of someone I'd once trusted. A part of me wanted to gloat. There's a human grain of satisfaction when karma is procedural and inevitable, but that past tasted sour. Exposing the truth had been necessary, but it had not been painless. The company I loved was bruised, employees were anxious, and the future we had all worked toward was clouded by scandal. There were personal costs, too. Ryan's supporters attacked my motives publicly, accusing me of betrayal, of ambition run wild. Social media spun the story into angles I hadn't anticipated. Some former colleagues whispered that I should have gone to the board sooner. Others admired my courage. Lawsuits, different ones, began to thread along with investigations. A countersuit alleging breach of confidentiality, a threatened defamation claim. That was why I'd prepared a legal fortress. Sealed documents, independent logs, notarized statements. When your opponent has money and lawyers, preparation is not optional, it's survival. But the most painful moments were private. I received texts from former friends who said they were so sorry this happened. My parents called, bewildered and worried. Some employees I'd mentored were shaken, their careers now tied to a company under scrutiny. I worked to reassure them, to help retain key staff, and to keep the business functioning while transparency and accountability took hold. In those weeks, I learned leadership's hardest lesson. Truth has consequences, but hiding the truth causes more damage in the long run. As investigations progressed, other revelations surfaced. Contracts signed without board approval, bonuses diverted through consultancy agreements, and a pattern of intimidation toward anyone who spoke up. The forensic accountant's deeper dive found that Ryan had used a network of nominees and shell entities to funnel funds into luxury purchases and private investments. Authorities began to track beneficial ownership, and the layers that had protected those funds started to peel away. Publicly, the company issued an internal communications campaign, voluntary audits for departments, hotlines for employees to report concerns, and a transparency task force led by an independent compliance officer. While some called it PR, many employees saw it as the first honest effort to rebuild culture. We held town halls. I spoke frankly about what had happened and why I'd brought the evidence forward. I didn't claim heroics, I explained processes and the steps we were taking to correct wrongs. The act of naming the problem helped people process it. Pain turned into purpose for some. Meanwhile, Ryan's life unraveled in ways that matched the gravity of the crimes. Accounts were frozen. Lawsuits were filed by investors and by the company itself. Prosecutors began to look at potential criminal charges: embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy. The man who once used charm as armor now faced an array of suits and investigations that would take years to resolve. He reached out to me once, through a lawyer, offering apologies that felt empty. I forwarded them to my attorney and let the legal process run its course. Months later, the company began the slow work of repair. Board seats were reshuffled. New compliance procedures were installed. Investors who had confidence in a renewed leadership returned cautiously. The financial damage was real. Recovery would be measured in quarters, not months. But the culture, a toxic one that allowed manipulation and secrecy, was being rebuilt with more rigorous checks and a renewed emphasis on ethics. On a personal note, I was changed. The fight drained me, but it also taught me what I could survive and what I would not tolerate. I had entered that office as someone who believed mentorship meant unconditional loyalty. I left it as someone who understood that loyalty is a two-way street, and that when it becomes a weapon it must be disarmed. People sometimes ask me if I regret exposing him. The answer is complicated. I regret the collateral pain, The employees who worried about their jobs, the family caught in the middle, the company's bruised reputation. But I do not regret stopping a man who profited by deception, who used other people as financial shields. In the long arc, truth preserved the enterprise's integrity and protected future employees and investors from further harm. There are small quiet victories that matter more than headlines. The junior project manager who'd been terrified about losing her job now leads a team because she stood up and told the truth. The contractor who'd been bribed into silence now speaks at conferences about corporate ethics. Investors who once considered the company suspect now call to discuss long-term rebuilding because transparency, finally, replaced silence. As for Ryan, the story didn't end with a dramatic prison sentence in my telling. Legal processes are slow and meticulous. But the public exposure ensured he could not easily hide, and the financial constraints imposed by the freezes and lawsuits meant he no longer operated with impunity. He lost his position, his status, and his freedom to animate the financial network he'd created. The month I walked out from the boardroom with the weight of the packet still heavy in my bag, I understood a new truth. Exposing corruption is messy, painful, and often lonely. But silence helps predators thrive. Someone had to be willing to risk reputation for the sake of truth. I chose that risk. In the years since, I rebuilt a life that honored the work I had done honestly. I started a new venture with transparent governance, stronger controls, and a promise to my team that no one's name would be used as a shield again. I still keep the sealed packet in a locked drawer, not as trophies, but as a reminder of what I refuse to look away from. If you find yourself in a similar position, used, framed, or betrayed, remember. Gather the facts, preserve the evidence, and protect your legal standing. Speak to trusted advisors. Recruit allies quietly. And when the time comes, let the truth speak with the weight of proof, not the heat of anger. It's the only way to ensure justice is not a rumor, but a record.